I was in a small government office in Satipo, Peru, late last year, watching a local official shuffle through a thick stack of legal ordinances. He looked like the kind of man who had spent his entire career worrying about mundane things like property taxes and zoning permits. Very dry, very pragmatic. But as he pointed to a specific clause in a new document, his demeanor shifted. He started talking about protecting the healers and guaranteeing the right to a clean home, his voice carrying a weight of genuine reverence. He told me about a group of citizens in his province who had finally been granted the legal standing they deserved after generations of service. He described how they had provided life-saving medicine during the height of the pandemic when the hospitals ran dry. I naturally assumed he was referring to an overlooked indigenous community or a group of frontline healthcare workers who had finally won a labor dispute. But then the atmosphere in the room changed. A representative from a local agricultural firm stepped in to ask about a new restriction on pesticide use near the forest edge. The official's face hardened instantly. He didn't cite environmental impact fees or commercial regulations. Instead, he looked the man in the eye and said, "You are infringing on the constitutional right to life of my clients. They have a right to reproduce in a healthy environment, and they haven't consented to your chemicals." When the representative asked who exactly these clients were, the official didn't gesture to a group of protesters outside. He pointed toward the tree line where a swarm of tiny stingless bees was hovering over the flora. That specific moment, the sight of a career bureaucrat treating a winged insect not as a resource or a pest, but as a legal plaintiff with inalienable rights, felt like watching the very foundation of modern law shift beneath my feet. The logic that nature is a tool for us to use had been replaced overnight by the logic of kinship. That leaves you wondering, if a creature that can't even sting you back now has the power to sue you in a court of law, what does that mean for the rest of the world?
That's an incredible scene. It really does sound like something out of a novel.
It felt like it. For a second, I thought I was misunderstanding the Spanish.
Yeah.
But no, he was deadly serious.
And that's the key, isn't it? The document he was pointing to, it wasn't poetry. It wasn't, some kind of spiritual manifesto.
No, it was a municipal ordinance. Dry, legal, state-sanctioned paper.
It has the full force of the state behind it. And that's what makes this so fascinating and so important to really dig into.
Right, because my first instinct, and I think a lot of people's, would be to dismiss it as some kind of, quirky local law. A bit of an outlier.
An eccentricity, something you'd see in a travel document.
Oh, look what those folks in the Amazon are up to. Yeah. But the official wasn't being quirky. He was talking about clients and constitutional rights. That's the language of litigation.
Serious litigation. And if we just see this as an environmental story, I think we miss the three bigger shifts that are happening underneath.
Which are?
Well, first, it's a radical rethinking of state capacity and even national security. Second, it's a hard-nosed recalibration of global economics and supply chains. And third, it's a challenge to our entire Western model of governance and institutional design. It's not just about bees.
The idea of a bee as a citizen is still a tough one to get your head around, though. I mean, citizenship comes with, responsibility.
It does, but what is the fundamental purpose of a state? It's to secure the conditions for life, for prosperity. We just normally think that means roads and armies.
Right, concrete and steel.
What's happening in Satipo and Nada is a recognition by the state that the biological machinery of the ecosystem is actually the most critical infrastructure they have.
So the bees are more important than the highway.
In an agricultural economy that depends on pollination, you could make a very strong case that, yes, they absolutely are. For the people there, this isn't some abstract legal theory.
Right. It's not a thought experiment. It's about survival. I heard a story recently about Mateo, a smallholder coffee farmer in the high jungle of Peru. For years, he watched his yields fluctuate wildly as the forests around him were thinned out, leaving his crops vulnerable to the cold volatility of global markets. But then the local ordinances granted legal rights to the stingless bees. I heard that Mateo doesn't see this as some abstract green gesture. For him, it is a hard-nosed, results-oriented state intervention. By protecting the bees' right to a clean habitat, the government effectively built a biological fortress around his livelihood. Imagine the shift. The state is no longer just taxing or regulating him, but actively securing the microscopic workers that ensure his coffee cherries actually grow. Watching this, I feel that while we often talk about state capacity in terms of digital infrastructure or military strength, Peru is showing us that true capacity lies in securing the foundation of life itself. I'll admit, framing an insect's right to life as a mechanism for national food security might sound a bit utilitarian or even overly statist to some. It's easy to get caught up in the cold logic of productivity metrics. However, from Mateo's perspective, this isn't just policy, it's survival. Even if the language of agricultural productivity feels heavy-handed, we have to respect the raw urgency of a community trying to shield its food supply from global instability.
Biological fortress. I think that phrase is perfect. It really gets to the heart of this first angle, the state capacity argument.
Because a fortress is a tool of national security.
Exactly. When we think about national security, we think about defending borders from, say, an invading army. That's a classic threat.
Sure.
But for Mateo, the coffee farmer, the existential threat isn't a tank rolling over the hill. The threat is pollination failure.
The threat is that his coffee plants put out beautiful flowers, but then nothing happens. No cherries.
His income is gone. The local economy crashes. Social instability, poverty, migration, all the things a state wants to prevent.
So protecting the bees is a form of preventative security. It's stopping the instability before it can even start.
It's the state intervening to secure the most fundamental piece of the economic machine. It's no different, functionally, from the Navy protecting a critical shipping lane or the government managing a strategic grain reserve.
I understand the analogy, but I still have to ask, how do you enforce a bee's rights? I mean, a shipping lane is easy. You can send a patrol boat. Right? How do you patrol a bee's right to reproduce? What does Ordinance 33/2025 in Satipo actually say? What are the mechanics of it?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting from a legal standpoint. It's not just a feel-good declaration. It grants very specific enumerated rights.
Such as?
The big ones are, 1, the right to exist, 2, the right to reproduce in a healthy ecosystem, and 3, the right to be free from pollution and harmful chemicals.
Okay. 1, the right to exist. Philosophical.
It's less about philosophy and more about habitat. It means you can't just clear-cut a section of forest that is known to be a primary nesting ground for them. It establishes that their presence is not optional.
So it's a bulwark against deforestation, essentially.
But the second right, the right to reproduce, that's where the real power is.
Specifically.
Because most environmental laws are what you call negative restrictions. Thou shalt not dump this chemical. They're about stopping direct, immediate harm. A right to reproduce is a positive right. It creates an obligation. It means the state, and by extension, the citizens and corporations, have a duty to maintain the environment at a standard high enough for the bee's life cycle to continue uninterrupted.
So say I'm a palm oil company, I buy some land, I'm not directly spraying the bees, but my plantation creates so much fragmentation.
Forest fragmentation, right.
That the bees can't travel between food sources or the queens can't find mates under this law.
You are infringing on their right to reproduce. The burden of proof shifts. You don't just have to show you aren't actively killing them. You have to show that your actions aren't undermining the viability of their future generations.
That is a massive legal hurdle. It seems almost impossible to enforce.
But this is where the specific biology of these bees becomes critical. Here, we are not talking about the bees you see in a field in North America or Europe.
Not the classic yellow and black honeybee.
No. Those are Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. They are, in fact, an invasive species in the Americas. They were brought over for agriculture.
Right.
The bees in question in Peru are the Meliponini, the native stingless bees.
Stingless, which probably helps their public relations campaign quite a bit.
It certainly doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
But their biology is what makes this law so potent. They've co-evolved with the Amazonian flora for millions of years.
So they're specialists.
They're small, they nest in hollow trees, and they are the only ones who can pollinate certain native plants. The data we have suggests they're responsible for the pollination of up to 80% of the Amazon's native plants.
80% is staggering. So you're telling me that if you remove this one type of insect, 4 out of every 5 plants in the rainforest stop making seeds?
Yes. The European honeybees, the generalists, they can't access the pollen in these complex, deep flowers. Without the meliponine, the forest becomes, well, a zombie forest.
A zombie forest.
The trees are still standing, they might even flower, but they're not reproducing. They have no offspring. They're the living dead.
So when the state protects the bee, it's not just protecting an insect. It's protecting the reproductive engine of the entire ecosystem.
The entire ecosystem that Mateo's coffee farm depends on. And that brings us back to enforcement. You asked who does it. The law establishes the concept of guardianship.
Guardians. So like a legal guardian for a child.
Exactly the same principle. Since a bee can't show up in court,
Right.
the municipality or a designated indigenous organization can act as their legal guardian and file a lawsuit on their behalf. People like Apucheza Ramos of Eco Ashaninka are designated as the legal voice for these bees.
And this actually stands up against, say, a multinational agro firm with a team of lawyers.
Well, this is where we come back to the encounter you described in the beginning. The official didn't argue about fines or regulations. He used a very specific phrase.
They haven't consented to your chemicals.
And that is the genius of this legal framing.
It sounds absurd at first. An insect can't consent.
Legally, it reframes the act of spraying pesticides from a simple regulatory violation, where you might pay a fine,
At cost of doing business.
to a bodily violation against a legal person. It elevates it to the level of assault. If I spray a toxic chemical on you without your consent, that's a serious crime.
So by granting the bee personhood, the law says spraying pesticides near their home is, legally speaking, the equivalent of assault.
And that's a much more serious legal threat. You can't just budget for it. The liability becomes potentially astronomical. It forces the corporation to the negotiating table to talk about buffer zones and alternative pest controls, not out of the goodness of their hearts.
But because the legal and financial risk of not doing so is suddenly too high.
It's a pragmatic, hard-nosed legal tool that protects Mateo's coffee crop. And that coffee crop, of course, doesn't just stay in Peru.
No. It enters the global market. And that's the second big piece of this, isn't it? The bee as an economic actor.
The bee as a market maker.
I was scrolling through some supply chain analysis reports when I came across the work of Elena, a woman from the Cucamonga community who works alongside researchers like Rosa Vasquez Espinosa. Elena tends to lit these stingless bee colonies not just out of tradition, but because she knows they are the invisible backbone of the global cacao trade. I heard that for every hectare protected by these new laws, the physical output for exports, specifically those feeding the massive demand in Asian confectionery hubs, becomes significantly more predictable. It's fascinating to think that a legal decree in a remote Amazonian municipality is actually a stabilizing force for a global commodity market. When I look at Elena's story, it hits me that biodiversity isn't just a moral choice. It's a quantifiable economic necessity. The right to reproduce for a bee in Peru is, quite literally, a price cap on a chocolate bar in Tokyo or Shanghai. I know some might find it jarring to reduce such a beautiful natural relationship to supply chain metrics or Asian market yields. It feels a bit like we're commodifying the sacred. But perhaps this is the only language the modern world understands. Linking the heartbeat of a bee to the heartbeat of the global economy might be the most effective way to ensure that bee keeps beating.
That direct line you just drew, from a bee in Peru to a chocolate bar in Tokyo, is a connection that global markets are only just beginning to properly understand and price in.
Usually the conversation about supply chains is about container ships, ports, and tariffs.
Logistics, the hardware. We tend to take the raw material for granted. We assume the cacao bean or the coffee bean will simply exist. We worry about how to move it, not how it's made.
But the bee is the factory worker that actually makes the bean.
And not just whether the bean gets made, but the quality of that bean. This is where those physical output metrics you mentioned become so important.
Yeah. You're talking about things like fruit weight, yield stability. How does a bee affect the weight of a piece of fruit?
It's all about the quality of the pollination. Think of a flower, like a cacao flower. To produce a healthy, full-sized fruit, all of its internal ovules need to be properly fertilized by pollen.
Okay.
If a pollinator is inefficient, maybe it just visits for a second and moves on, it might only fertilize half of them. The result is a smaller, often misshapen fruit, a runt.
And a farmer like Elena, she sells her cacao by weight.
So an inefficient pollinator is literally taking money out of her pocket.
But these stingless bees, the Meliponini, they're specialists.
They are incredibly thorough. They've evolved to work these specific flowers perfectly. The data from other crops is pretty clear. I know there was a study on strawberries in Brazil, for example. Fields pollinated by native stingless bees saw a 15% increase in the average weight of the berry.
15%. That's not a marginal gain. For a farmer, that's the difference between a good year and a bad year.
It's pure profit generated by a healthy ecosystem. Now, scale that up. Think about the buyer in Asia, a major chocolate company. What do they want more than anything?
Consistency.
Predictability. They need every shipment of cacao beans to meet a certain quality standard. They can't have half of them being underdeveloped. The stability of the bee population in Satipo directly translates to the stability of their manufacturing process in Shanghai.
Which means the bee's right to reproduce is actually a financial instrument. It's a form of supply chain risk management.
And this is where we see the term biodiversity risk entering the conversation in financial circles, in ESG reports.
What is biodiversity risk from an investor's point of view?
An investor is starting to understand that many agricultural commodities, palm oil, coffee, soy, cacao, have what's called a high biodiversity footprint. Their production often degrades the very ecosystem they rely on.
It's a business model that eats itself.
Exactly. That's a transition risk. If you're a fund manager and you've invested heavily in a company whose entire business model depends on slash and burn agriculture, you are sitting on a time bomb. Because when the pollinators collapse, the yields collapse.
And the stock price follows.
Inevitably. Markets hate volatility. A region with unstable pollination, maybe because of pesticide drift from a neighboring farm, will have its commodities priced with a risk premium.
It's seen as less reliable.
But an area like Satipo, with its legal biological fortress, suddenly becomes more attractive. Their output is seen as more stable, more predictable. It's a de-risked asset.
So Elena's cacao isn't just organic or ethical. From a hard-nosed market perspective, it's simply a safer bet.
The legal protection for the bees acts as a guarantee of future productivity.
And we haven't even touched on the other product from these bees, the honey.
Yes, the pot honey, which is really a category all its own.
It's not like the honey we're used to. It's runnier, I've read, and has a more sour or acidic taste.
Right. It has a much higher moisture content, and it's less sweet because the sugars are more complex. But its value isn't really as a sweetener, it's as a medicine.
For centuries, indigenous communities have used it for things like eye infections, wounds, sore throats.
And now, modern science is beginning to understand why. Researchers like Rosa Vasquez Espinosa are analyzing its chemical composition, and what they're finding is remarkable.
What kind of properties?
Potent antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory compounds, for a start. But the really groundbreaking research is looking into its potential cytotoxicity.
Cytotoxicity, that means it's toxic to cells, right?
Yes, but the hope is that it's selectively toxic. There's early-stage lab research, and I want to stress, this is very early, suggesting that certain compounds in the honey can inhibit the growth of some cancer cell lines in a petri dish.
So it's essentially a natural chemotherapy agent.
That's the potential they're exploring. The forest, through the bee, is producing a complex pharmaceutical cocktail.
And that potential is reflected in the price. The numbers I saw were anywhere from $40 to $200 a liter.
Compare that to maybe $10 a liter for standard clover honey. It's a completely different market.
Everything. The honey could be worth more than the primary crop the bees are pollinating.
It diversifies her income and creates an incredibly powerful economic incentive for conservation.
Right, you can't just set up a bunch of these beehives in the middle of a giant single crop plantation.
The medicinal complexity of the honey comes directly from the biodiversity of the bees' diet. They need to forage from hundreds of different types of native plants, flowers, and tree resins to create that chemical profile.
So to get the $200 liter honey, you are forced to preserve the rainforest.
The economic incentive and the ecological imperative are perfectly aligned. You can't have one without the other.
Which is the goal of all sustainable development, really. But it only works if the underlying system of governance values the bee in the first place.
Which brings us to the third and maybe the most profound lens for looking at this. We've covered the state and the market, but the reason this law even exists comes from a worldview that predates both.
The idea of the bee as kin.
Actually, the institutional model.
I saw a video recently featuring an Ashaninka leader who was contrasting these kinship laws with the environmental policies he's seen imported from the West. He described Western conservation as procedural individualism, a world where lawyers argue over individual property lines while the entire ecosystem collapses in the background. In contrast, this new Peruvian model treats the bee as a relative, a kin with a right to exist. It isn't a contract with nature, it's a pact for collective survival. I heard him explain that while Western NGOs come and go with their short-term grants and four-year political cycles, the kinship law is designed for the long term, rooted in thousands of years of indigenous observation. To me, this highlights a massive gap in institutional efficacy. It's a bit provocative to suggest that primitive kinship models are more efficient than our modern liberal procedures. It might even feel right-wing in its emphasis on traditional ancestral order over modern liberal procedures. However, we have to be honest, if our current procedural ways are failing to stop the collapse of the biosphere, maybe the radical step is actually the most pragmatic one. We can respect the personhood of an insect as a legal innovation, while still navigating the complexities of our own modern world. It's about finding a model that actually works before the clock runs out.
Procedural individualism. That phrase is incredibly powerful. It really diagnoses the core weakness of the Western environmental model.
It took me a minute to fully grasp it, but his explanation was so clear. Our legal system is built on conflict between individuals. My property rights versus your property rights.
It's adversarial by design, and crucially, it's almost always reactive. Yes. In our system, I generally can't sue you for environmental damage until the damage has already been done. We wait for the river to be polluted, we wait for the forest to be cut down, then we go to court to argue about the financial compensation.
It's a system designed for cleanup, not prevention.
But the worldview of the Ashaninka and the Kukama Kukamiri starts from a completely different place. The bee isn't a piece of property, the forest isn't a resource, they are relatives, kin.
Which, again, sounds nice poetically, but how does that translate into a more effective governance model?
Well, think about the different ways you treat an asset versus a family member. You maintain your car, so it provides a service. You protect your grandmother because her well-being is inherently tied to your own. You don't wait for her to fall down the stairs to install a handrail. Your care is proactive.
So kinship law is proactive by its very nature. It's about maintaining the health of the relationship.
It is preventative governance. And the biocultural protocols being developed are the instruction manuals for that prevention.
That's another term that sounds quite futuristic, biocultural protocols.
It does, but it's based on ancient knowledge. These are essentially sets of rules for interaction with the ecosystem, codified from millennia of direct observation.
Can you give me an example?
A protocol might state that a specific species of tree, say the shwawako, cannot be logged during a certain season because that's when a particular bee species relies on it for nesting. Or it might mandate the planting of certain medicinal shrubs near a crop, not just for human use, but because they support the health of the pollinators.
So it's not a vague do no harm. It's a highly specific technical set of operating procedures for the ecosystem.
And because that knowledge base spans hundreds of generations, it's arguably a much more robust data set than a typical 3 or 5 year environmental impact study funded by an outside group.
This gets to the Ashaninka leader's point about institutional efficacy and the 4-year political cycles.
Right. An NGO gets a grant, they run a project for a few years, then the funding dries up or the political winds change, and the project collapses.
But the ecosystem operates on a timeline of centuries.
Exactly. You can't manage a forest with a 4-year plan. The kinship model is a permanent covenant. Your relationship to your kin doesn't have an expiration date.
So by putting this indigenous worldview into a modern legal document, municipal ordinance, they've created a kind of hybrid institution.
That's the innovation here. It's using the mechanisms of the modern state court's legal standing enforcement to uphold the wisdom of a deep-time governance structure.
It's an attempt to weld the two together.
And it has to be, because we have to be honest with ourselves. The old model is failing. The rate of biodiversity loss is proof that procedural individualism is not an effective tool for preventing biosphere collapse.
It's a sobering thought that the most pragmatic and efficient step forward might be to look back to a system of governance that has been practiced for thousands of years.
Perhaps the most radical innovation is remembering what already works.
But this movement isn't just happening in Peru. This is part of a global trend, isn't it? The rights of nature movement.
We've seen similar legal frameworks emerge around the world.
The most famous is probably the Wanganui River in New Zealand.
Right, which was granted the legal status of an ancestor to the Maori iwi. We've also seen it with the Magdalena River in Colombia, and even for sea turtles in Panama.
But there feels like a difference here. A river or a sea turtle population. They're discrete entities. You can draw a line around them. A bee.
A bee is a network.
Exactly. It's mobile. It's everywhere. It connects everything.
And that's why this case in Peru might be the most significant development yet. When you grant rights to a river, you are protecting a specific geographical feature. When you grant rights to a pollinator,
you are implicitly granting rights to everything the pollinator touches.
You have to protect the web. If the bee has a right to a healthy home, then doesn't the flower it feeds on also have a right to exist? What about the soil microbiome that nourishes the flower? The law is being forced to stop thinking in terms of individual objects and start thinking in terms of relationships and systems.
It's forcing the legal code to reflect ecological reality. So to pull these threads together, we've really looked at this one legal change in Peru through 3 completely different lenses.
Right.
First, as a function of the state. Here, the bee is a piece of critical national infrastructure, and protecting it is an act of food security and economic defense.
It's Mateo's biological fortress.
Second, we looked at it through the lens of the market. The bee is an economic engine, a de-risking agent for global supply chains, and a producer of a high-value medicinal product.
It's a stabilizer and a value creator, Elena's economic partner.
And third, as a new model of institutional governance. The bee is kin, and this relationship provides a more effective, long-term, and preventative framework for managing an ecosystem than our current Western models.
It's a more efficient system for collective survival.
And it's important to remember this wasn't just one group. It was a collaboration between indigenous leaders, scientists, and legal experts. A true hybrid approach.
Yeah.
You know, throughout this whole deep dive, my mind keeps going back to that initial image. The bureaucrat in that small government office.
The one with his clients.
His clients. That one word changes everything. And I've been thinking about the precedent it sets. Because, let's face it, a stingless bee is a fairly easy case to make. It's helpful, it's benign, it makes valuable honey.
It's a charismatic insect, if there is such a thing.
Right. But what happens when we take the logic seriously? If we accept that a non-human entity can be granted legal personhood because of its vital functional role in a larger system, or because of its ancestral relationship to a community, then we are opening a door to a radically different legal future. If a bee is a person because it enables the forest to reproduce, what about the fungal network under the soil that decomposes dead matter and cycles nutrients? Its role is just as vital. What about an AI that manages a city's water supply with perfect efficiency? Does its utility grant it standing? We are seeing the definition of a legal person being stretched. And this shift in Peru, it might just be the first tremor. The logic they've established could trigger a legal earthquake that completely reorders our assumed hierarchy of life, changing our status from owners of the planet to just one stakeholder among many.